been in the making for over 70 years. I'm 76 years old, born in 48, and I probably have an unusual situation. I have two boyhood idols that both were Auburn car dealers and agents. And when I grew up, my parents lived in a large duplex house in Van Wert that was owned by a guy named Horace Bonnewitz. And I lived on the one side, and my parents left after a period of time and got their own home. But I can remember going to Horace's home, seeing Horace and his wife Laura. Horace was an Auburn dealer at least 1910 and maybe earlier. I had a unique experience. In the early 90s, people know I have a story coming Van Wert. I was up on the scaffolding stripping paint on some tin work, and I looked down, there was two ladies watching me in a Cadillac. I got down off the scaffolding and asked if I could help them, and it turned out the elderly lady was probably in the late 80s, early 90s, was Horace Bonnewitz's niece. I was able to obviously to interview her and get more information. The other gentleman was my uncle, Dean Pennell. And I was very close to my uncle. And at a very early age, I learned that he had an Auburn dealership at age 21. And I was very young. And he had some other businesses. I was told that he was an Auburn dealer. He had a bus line that ran Auburn Accord limousines. He'd buy stuff at the factory during the end of the model years and buy a Rex and put stuff together. Who knows what he put together? But before I get into the details about Horace Bonnewitz and my uncle Dean Pennell, I want to go back to 1891. These two gentlemen, to this day, I have as an impression on how I do things in my life. But I want to go back to 1891. I think there's people that influenced Horace Bonnewitz and Dean Pennell. I think I just talked about what I learned. Oh, also I learned at a very young age that my grandfather, Otto Pennell, when he was 21, built his first car in Van Wert with his partner Noah Clifton. And when he met Grandma or Mabel, he thought Mabel was more important than building cars, and he sold his interest to his partner Noah. And there's also stories about Jigger Johnson. And Jigger started out in 1911 as a mechanic on the Indianapolis 500. And when the writing mechanics came back in Indianapolis in 1930 through 37, Jigger was on the first place car twice running shotgun. And even at an early age, I was an explorer. I'd be hunting through my grandparents' homes and garages and crawl spaces, trying to find any relics left over from the Auburn dealership. But again, I want to go back to 1891, who I think are some people that influenced Horace Bonnewitz and Dean Pennell. Oh, during my exploring years, I'm not following my slides well, but in my early years, I told you I was going through my grandparents' home looking for any relics left over from the Auburn dealership. I found printing plates in the basement of the house, and these were the printing plates of the Auburn cars that later on that were printed off by Jay Engler, one of the long-term Auburn Cords and Duesenbergs members. Also, at my grandparents' house, I was told that the garage was extended to accommodate Uncle Dean's Cord, and the back of the garage was cut out like an upside-down T, so the hood and the fenders would go through the back of the garage. Then my grandfather brought home box cord doors from the Cincinnati Northern Railroad yards to extend the garage on a lean-to. Okay. One of the persons that I think had influence on leased Horace Bonnewitz was John Lambert. In Ohio City, Ohio, in 1891, they claimed that the first successful automobile was built. That's Wert County. Originally, they gave credit to the DeRay brothers, who had built their first car in 1892, and later on, they think that John Lambert had the first successful car. One thing that may surprise people, in that period of time, between 1885 and about 1905, that was the great Northwest Ohio oil boom. At that period of time, there was thousands of oil wells in Northwest Ohio, including Van Wert. And Ohio City, Ohio was an oil well boom town, an oil well supply town. There was oil wells there. People that know my home in Van Wert's an historic home. It was built by John Reed. John Reed had an engineering degree in wood design, and John Reed made sucker rods for the oil well industry. And that's where he made his money. You might say my home was built with oil money. Okay. The next person I think had an influence was Noah Clifton and Otto Pennell, which built their first car in 1896. And that was 5 years later than Lambert and 7 miles down the road from Van Wert. This was the first successful car. This is the first car in the city of Van Wert. I don't know how it happened, but we got a letter. My grandfather, Otto Pennell, went off to the Spanish-American War, and he wrote a letter back to his partner, Noah, in August 1st, 1898, and it wasn't much to do. You're sitting around the Army base at Camp Chickamauga, but his last comment in the letter was, "I hope I will be the first one to ride on the buggy, as these mules are too slow." The last report we had, I think my uncle told me that the last report they saw was this car was on a country road being pulled by a horse. The car that was built was a one-cylinder engine. It was a brass cylinder. They shrunk a 6-inch water jacket, shrunk a piece of 6-inch water pipe to create the water jacket. It was tiller steering. It was a hot ball engine. The next person I think had an influence on Bonnewitz and my Uncle Dean Pennell was George Marsh. There's a picture of George, and George was the richest man in Wert County. He owned many manufacturing companies. He was president of Lima Locomotive Works. He was a part owner of 19 banks, and I would say he was a visionary. And he had a lot of railroad experience. In his last will and testament, he created the Marsh Foundation, which was a first-class children's home, state-of-the-art at the time it was built. And one thing, here's a picture of the first yearbook of the Marsh Foundation Children's Home, and it shows girls in a class taking automobile mechanics. And the dialogue in the yearbook said, both boys and girls starting in 5th grade through 8th grades took automobile mechanics. And they also had a state-of-the-art vocational school. And that had to have an influence on the future car dealerships in Van Wert. I think a lot of the mechanics in the dealerships came from the Marsh Vocational School. Something else that I heard, there was a guy named Jack Weaver in Van Wert, and people from Van Wert probably know the name. He was known as the Weatherman, but he was one of the early administrators at the Marsh Foundation and the vocational school. I talked to Jack's daughter many years ago, and she talked about the vocational school in the late 20s built an airplane at the Marsh Foundation. And her mother and her father flew over Van Wert in the airplane that the vocational school and the Marsh kids had built on their honeymoon. I found that it's absolutely astounding. Also, talking to a guy named Louis Haynes, which many people from Van Wert would know. He had a garage for years. It was Louis who modified an automobile engine to work in the airplane. I think this is the airplane that came from the Marsh Foundation. I'm not absolutely sure, but it looks like it. So that gives you an idea of what was going on in Van Wert early on. It was a lot of surprising things. I forgot to mention one thing about George Marsh. In probably the mid-1990s, showed up in an antique dealer in Van Wert with stacks and stacks of early automobile literature that came from Katie Clymer's estate. Katie Clymer was George's daughter, only daughter. And this literature was pristine condition, but it started right after 1900, and it was the Van Wert car dealerships. Things like Waverly Electric. It went up to the early 30s and had some V16 Cadillac stuff. It was absolutely amazing, the literature in the car dealerships that were in Van Wert very, very early. And it had to be, I'm thinking it had to be due to a lot of George Marsh's financing and leadership. I couldn't afford the literature. I'd like to have bought it. There was a gentleman from New York, Walter Miller. He's a big world-known literature collector for automobile memorabilia. He was headed to Van Wert. I got a hold of a guy named John Martin Smith here from Auburn. It was early on in establishing this museum, and John came to Van Wert and bought all the literature. Okay, I'm going to talk about the first Auburn dealership in Van Wert, and this was started by the Bonnewitz brothers. The Bonnewitzes were a prominent family in Van Wert. They had the only ever 5-story building in Van Wert, and it was a 5-story department store. In 1909, it burnt down and was totally destroyed. After that, they had 2 sons, Horace and Van Bonnewitz, and they rebuilt that building on the same site for an Auburn dealership. If you remember, earlier on I said that I talked to the 2 ladies. One of them was a niece of Horace and her daughter. His niece talked about that the Bonnewitzes had a cottage on Lake James. And when they traveled from Van Wert to Lake James, they would stop by in Auburn, and that's how they got interested in the Auburn cars. And that's how they established a dealership. They built a fabulous building in Van Wert where the previous building had burnt down. But Horace and the niece said they had a dealership someplace in Van Wert prior to 1910. Don't know the location of that. So that had to be a very, very early Auburn dealer. Here was an ad out of a phone book that shows Van Wert Garage. That would be the Bonnewitz Brothers Van Wert Garage. They not only were agents for Auburn Automobile, but they also sold Eckert buggies. The Bonnewitz building from about 1910 to 1920 was the Bonnewitz Brothers Garage and an Auburn dealer. After that, when they stopped having the dealership, and back then, when the Bonnewitzes were in business having with the Auburn dealership, they had a mechanic named Russ Smith, and we'll talk about Russ later. In 1920, there was an ad that they used this building, keeping in mind they had an elevator that could put cars on all 3 floors. The blueprints showed they had a turntable in it. It was a pretty fancy building. I have the architectural blueprints for it. And in 1920, there was an advertisement that all the car dealerships in Van Wert would all display their cars in one place and have a car show. Be like an auto mall, you might say, back then. There was ads later on. That building was used to, it's called Lexington Motors. Later on, it was called Van Wert Garage. They sold cars like Lexingtons or made in Connersville, which was later purchased by Cord Corporation. They made Stutzes. They sold Oldsmobiles. Cleveland cars, DuPont, which is a high-end car, and Derby and Oldsmobile trucks. After that, that building was used for Model T and Model A Ford dealerships. It was Hellman Ford, Jan Ford, and Raby Ford. For some reason, the dealerships didn't stay in business very long. Maybe it seemed like a year or two, and it changed ownerships. They may have changed brands of cars. And later, that building was converted for J.C. Penney, and the latest use was Mentoring Sporting Goods. Today, that building is owned by the Van Wert County Foundation, and it's being preserved. And talked to Seth Baker, and there's not a tenant yet, but the building is being preserved for future use. After Horace Bonnewitz got out of the Auburn dealership and the garages, he started a battery business. And this was on South Washington Street, where Angel Intervention is now. Used to be the Walters Law offices. And he made batteries. I found it interesting, in 1920, when he started the battery business, there was 4 battery businesses that started up in Van Wert. Bonnewitz sold Exide. There was another dealer that sold Delco, Willard, and Prestolite. This was the same time that in 1919 was the first year for Ford to put an electric starter on a car. So there started to become a demand for batteries. Also in the early 20s, that's when they started having home radios, and a lot of the rural people would need batteries for their radios. And the paper at that time showed that Van Wert had 30 electric cars. I don't know how many electric cars are in Van Wert today, but I don't know if there's 30 yet. But in 1920, there was 30. In February of 1992, there was an auction. They were going to sell this building where the battery shop was at auction. And I went through the building, and on the second floor of the building was Horace Bonnewitz's workshop. And his workbench was there, and it still had on the workbench 2 unfinished chandeliers like he walked out from many, many years ago. And here was one of the, I think it was like a solid steel rule that possibly when he made the batteries and put like a tar top on them, they'd roll this over on top to put the insignia in for Bonnewitz Brothers Battery Company. Horace was quite a craftsman, and he took the lead from the batteries and he made chandeliers for churches and office buildings. And if those of people who have been to the Presbyterian Church, the beautiful chandeliers there are shown in this picture were made with the battery lead. And here's some other pictures of the chandeliers he made. Go back. And I can remember as a young boy being in Horace's workshop, seeing him work on making chandeliers. Another thing that Horace did that I found intriguing and impressed me as a young boy, Horace also made automatons. Automatons were mechanical figures that were, the movement was made by cams and gears and all kinds of linkages. And he made those, and I can remember going to his house and he would show me the arms and legs and stuff he was making for these automatons. And there was one of those was in the Campbell's Hardware store where the municipal court building is located now. And he made an automaton that he called a window tapper. And the automaton would tap the window with a stick, put his head back and forth, roll his eyes, go down, and turn the page on the displays. Actually, this display was advertisement for local businesses. And he gave me a gearbox and a motor and stuff for an automaton. So I guess in summary, for Horace Bonnewitz and their family, they had the only 5-story building in Van Wert. They rebuilt it as Bonnewitz Brothers Garage, which is an Auburn dealership for Auburn automobiles and Eckert buggies. He had a battery store. He built chandeliers for churches and offices, and he made automatons. And I think you can see why he got my attention as a young boy. One of the mechanics that worked for Horace was Russ Smith. And Russ Smith, when he left the dealership, he went down on South Market Street in what was called Gunsett's Horse and Mule Barn. And they cleared out the mule barn stalls and started a garage to repair automobiles. And it was an early Auburn dealership. And then that was going on while he was building a new building, the corner of Main and Walnut. And they started a dealership there that actually was 24/7. Keep in mind, this was a period of time that Van Wert was right on the Lincoln Highway. It was US 30 was the main route from California to New York. And there was a lot of traffic. This was one of several dealerships in Van Wert and garages that never shut down. And after Russ started the Auburn dealership, I don't think it lasted very long. He went on to Hudson Cars, then Buick, and ended up with Nash and Ramblers. And he was a close friend of Dean Pennell, which is my uncle. This is a picture of the early Auburn dealership in Van Wert. This is the second one. And if you look at all the gas pump and sign memorabilia, the collectors would go, this would be desirable stuff to own. That building is still in existence today, and it's owned by the Van Wert County Foundation, and that's going to also be preserved. One thing I forgot to mention is the Bonnewitz building was also a parking garage for people to park their cars. Keep in mind, early on, most of the residents in Van Wert did not keep their horse and buggy at the home. They kept the horse and buggy downtown in a livery stable. They didn't have garages. You notice a lot of the big homes in Van Wert never had garages. The garages that are there were added afterwards. The Smith's garage also had a parking garage, and that was for the occupants, the people that stayed at the Marsh Hotel. I haven't found any advertising for the Auburn dealership that it was started by Russ Smith, but I did get the cash register printing plate that belonged to Smith's garage, and the printing plate would be out in the National Cash Register. So every time you would get a receipt out of Russ Smith's garage, you'd get a picture of an Auburn Beauty 6. And this came out of the estate of Earl Smith, which was the son of Russ Smith. So you can see there in the printing plate. Okay, we talked about the Bonnewitz building had a parking garage. This had a parking garage. And here was the third parking garage in Van Wert. And this had a capacity of 500 cars. And when I was going through some phone books in the 90s, and I realized that in 1920 there was 3 indoor parking garages in Van Wert, and one of them had a capacity of 500 cars, and that just amazed me that Van Wert had that. So by that time I became a fairly good friend of John Martin Smith. John Martin Smith was one of the persons that was involved in starting this museum. He was quite an historian. So I can remember the phone call well. I called John's law office, and the secretary answered the phone, and she says, well, Mr. Smith's with a client right now, and click, John came on the line and says, what do you got, Dave? And so I explained to John that in 1920, Van Wert had 3 indoor parking garages, and one of them had a capacity of 500. That didn't make any sense, you know. And then John explained to me that, yes, it was a carryover from the days of the livery stable when the residents of Van Wert kept their horse and buggy downtown so you didn't have the smell in the backyard. It was also, at that period of time, there was mail delivery twice a day. And you could send a postcard in the morning to the garage and they bring the car out for you to go touring in the afternoon. Also, Van Wert was very, very early in having telephone service. I found it very interesting. This building's still standing today in Van Wert. The number 3 Auburn dealership in Van Wert, which I know nothing about, was in Convoy, Ohio. And I found this ad in the paper, and it was in Convoy, and it was Theo Crasher. I imagine that was Theodore Crasher. This was 1927. It was in Bell Brothers Garage. That building is still in existence today in Convoy. I'm going to talk next about my first visit to this museum. I'd heard the stories for years about my uncle and the dealership and the bus line that he had and putting things together and the race cars he had, but I'd never seen the Auburns. And in 1978, I was working for Federal Mogul in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I had frequent trips to the Indianapolis area, but I always flew. And this trip, for some reason, I drove from Ann Arbor down to Indianapolis, and I left work early so I could come to this museum. So I came to the Auburn Cords and Duesenbergs Museum in 1978 for the very first time. I only had a half an hour to see the museum, and so I had a lightning round through the museum. The museum wasn't full yet. There was a lot of areas that were blocked off with curtains. And I was getting ready to leave. I saw a gentleman coming down the main staircase here, and he had a tag that said, Director. So I went up to this gentleman and introduced myself, said, yes, my name is Dave Kirchenbauer. I'm from Van Wert, Ohio, and my uncle, Dean Pennell, at age 21, had a dealership and a distributorship to sell Auburn's Cords and Duesenbergs. He also had some race cars from the factory. He operated the bus line using Auburn and Cord limousines, and he would buy a lot of the leftover parts and stuff from the change of model years. He'd buy wrecked Auburns and Cords and put things together. And it was Skip Marchetti. And Skip says, if you have some time, I want to show you something. So I followed Skip back up the staircase. We went back where the freight elevator is for the cars. And this is what he showed me. He showed me water pump or generator or something, and it was for front-wheel drive cord. And Skip says, we know nothing about a 12-cylinder front-wheel drive cord engine. And then he showed me this body that came from Warshawski's in Chicago. Warshawski's started out as being a junkyard, sold used car parts, and they ended up having a catalog for a lot of automobile parts. And they sent the catalogs and they sold parts all over the United States. So this body came from Warshawski's in Chicago, and Skip says, but the body serial number and stuff says it should be a 16-cylinder, not a 12-cylinder. We know nothing about a 16-cylinder front-wheel drive cord. And this is another picture of the body. This shows Skip Marchetti on the right, and Paul Bryant was a historian for the Auburn Cords and Duesenbergs Club that was very interested in cords on the left, and I got to know both of those gentlemen. And here's the car sort of put together. There wasn't any frame originally, and then they found the radiator shell down at Gaslight Auto Parts in Urbana. So they had the three components but no running gear. So on my trip, I went to Indianapolis and I drove back through Van Wert, and I noticed I was being transferred back to Van Wert, promoted, and I was excited about that. I went saw my Uncle Dean Pennell, and I told him about my new job and moving back, and he was glad. Then I told him about my experience at the museum, and he lit up. And he knew everything there was to know probably about the development of the 16-cylinder front-wheel drive engine. And this is what my uncle told me. He said, this project started out as a 16-cylinder front-wheel drive cord, and it had four-wheel independent suspension. The cylinders were so close together that they couldn't cool it right. So they had to drop back, spread the cylinders apart, and made a 12-cylinder engine. My Uncle Dean Pennell worked off and on for a company called Semet Solvay in Owasso, Michigan. And I think there's a lot of history to be uncovered about Semet Solvay. And one of the things he did while working for Semet Solvay, they made additives for castings. And they would go out in the field to solve engine block casting problems. And he did works for, I think, with Simplicity or made big oil well engines down in Springfield, Ohio. He did work for Continental Engines and others, but he knew all the details about the development of that engine. Later on, which we'll talk about the bus line a lot more, there's a guy named L.J. Mitchell in Van Wert who him and his brother owned the Greenville-Dayton Transportation Company, which eventually became part of Trailways. And they bought that car for the suspension system. And LJ, according to his widow, Margaret Mitchell, was always trying to improve the ride on the buses. And according to my uncle, that this special chassis with the special suspension system was tested on North Cherry Street here in Van Wert. And North Cherry Street at that time would have had at least 6 railroad tracks on it, had a steep incline, and it was probably very rough. And that's where you evaluate the suspension system. The driver who drove that special chassis was Jigger Johnson, who had been the mechanic at the 500 and came to Van Wert in 1932 to maintain the Auburn limousines on the Greenville-Dayton bus line. I've written an article about my first visit. It has probably more detail than I've explained. And if anyone wants a copy of that, my cards are on the back table. You send me an email and I'll send you that article that I've written about my first visit. And it's several pages here. We talked a little bit about Jigger. And Jigger started out as a mechanic in 1911, as we talked about. But this is an interesting cartoon that from the 1931 race. He was riding with the driver Louis Meyer, and according to the article, that the last lap or two, Jigger and Louis took the lead. As soon as they took the lead, the driver Louis realized he had oil over his goggles and thought he needed to shut the engine down. When he realized what happened was, when he took the lead, Jigger got so excited he spit his tobacco juice in his face. Here is the picture of the experimental Cord with the 12-cylinder engine as it is in the museum today. And of course, you saw the earlier pictures when it was as found in 78. And that's a picture of Jigger. Jigger was in the winning car twice in the 30s. This is the 37 race, and that's Jigger in the driver's seat, little guy. And there's a lot of stories about this guy, and I was told that men would spend their evenings telling Jigger Johnson stories. I talked to one lady when I was young, and she talked about going to Jigger's speakeasy out on east of Van Wert, and when they were teenagers during Prohibition. This would have been at the Sinclair station just over the tracks on North Washington Street in Van Wert. Used to be Best Auto. Okay, so this sort of summarizes Jigger. He started out as a mechanic in 1911 at Indy. He was involved from 1911 to I don't know when the last year he was involved, probably in the 40s, maybe the 50s. He was brought to Van Wert in 1931 or 32 to maintain the Auburn Airport limousines. He was maintaining the Auburn Airport limousines in Indianapolis for Century Airlines, and the vehicles that were brought to Van Wert were identical. The Auburn limousines that were operated in the Greenville-Dayton, the local people in Van Wert would refer to those as the big cars. And I've also written articles about that, and if you'd like a copy, just send me an email and I'll send it to you via the email. And this is a picture of Jigger Johnson and Wilbur Shaw in 1937 in front of the Marsh Hotel. Wilbur was the driver of the car when he won the race in 37. And that's the cartoon again. Okay. In 1992, I came to work in Auburn for Cooper Engineered Products, part of Cooper Tire. And I just had back surgery. So I couldn't do much physically, so I had to find something to do with my time. And that's when I started a lot of the research on my uncle's dealership. And what I knew was he started a dealership when he was 21 years old. And I had his birth date, so I figured out he was born in May, so in 1928 he would have turned 21 years old. And I went to the microfilm at the Broomback Library in Van Wert and pulled out the 1928 microfilm, and here it was the first ad for Pennell Auburn Company in 1928 in May. And the dealership was located in my great-grandfather's livery stable. At this period of time, it seems like it was not, Van Wert had a lot of livery stables downtown. It was not unusual for the livery stable to be renovated and converted to a car dealership or a repair garage, because people were getting rid of the horses and buying cars. Also, I found out that anytime my uncle put an ad in the paper, there was two papers in Van Wert. It was the Van Wert Times and the Van Wert and the Bulletin. The Bulletin was Republican, the Times was Democrat. So if I found an ad in one paper, I'd go to the other paper on exactly the same day and there'd be another ad, but a different ad, so I could find 2 ads in one day. So this was the first ad in the Daily Bulletin. That would have been the Republican paper. My uncle also talked about that he purchased the Auburn Boattail Speedster to set the records at Atlantic Board Speedway in Daytona Beach. And he drove it around the streets of Van Wert, wrecked it twice. The second time, he damn near killed himself, and that was the end of the Auburn Boattail Speedster. These were 2 ads, one in each paper on the same day, talking about the Boattail Speedsters. Setting their records at, I think it was Atlantic Board Speedway. Here would another picture of the Auburn Speedster. Here are more ads. Now, the ad, I think it's on this ad on the right side is my favorite. This is 1932. This was the worst year of the Great Depression. Things have bottomed out. And here the ad says, prices slashed to put men back to work. And you could buy a 12-cylinder Auburn reduced down to a little over $1,000. And prices had dropped a lot. Here's another ad, and the cartoon on the right-hand side is of Babe Ruth. This is the period of time it was. Then they had the dual ratios. When I was doing my research, I went to Broomback Library a lot, going through the microfilm looking for car ads. And one of the librarians came up to me and says, Dave, there's something in the vertical file cabinets about Auburn. And here it was that they had put the Broomback Library on Van Wert on the mailing list for these factory magazines. These magazines were in 1929. There were 3 of them in there at the Broomback Library. These magazines have a lot of good information and history about Auburn and Cord. Primarily, the articles in these magazines were, some of them were articles written by E.L. Cord himself, and it was leading up to the introduction of the L29 Cord, the first production front-wheel drive car built in the United States. And it included the introduction of the car. I have these, again, if you'd like a copy, just take my card, send me an email, I can send those to you. Here's some of Pennell's cars that he had. I'm sure there was more. And this is the time I'm going to tell. My uncle was quite a storyteller. And I will share some of the stories that he told me. One story he had was he said he received a telegram from the factory that there's some Auburns that had been stolen. And in the telegram, he listed the serial numbers of the car. And he said a few days later, after he received the telegram, 2 well-dressed men came into the dealership with a new Auburn that had a bad starter on it. And to repair it, so these 2 well-dressed men left and went downtown to Baggett's coffee shop, as most people from Van Wert would know. And so when they left, my uncle went down to rolled back the floor mat or the carpet on the car to verify the serial number, which would have been on the passenger side where your feet are. And he rolled the mat back and burnt into the floorboards that said, property of Al Capone. So he said he contacted the factory and told them what he found. He says, well, don't worry about it. We'll send you a starter. And back in that period of time, the interurban was an operation, and there were, according to John Martin Smith, there was an interurban car leaving Auburn going south every half an hour, and there were 12 or 13 round trips between Fort Wayne and Lima in interurban that period of time. So my uncle could get a part from the factory in an hour and a half or 2 hours. When the interurban came through town, we'd drop the part off. Then he said that he repaired the car, and then the men came back, and he told them there were no charge, and they gave him a substantial tip and left. Also early on, when I was probably 12 years old, my uncle said he was really a Cord fan. He really liked the front wheel drive Cords, both the L29 and the 810, 812s. And he told me why he thought the L29 Cord failed or wasn't as successful as it should have been. And what he told me was that on the front wheel drive universal joint, there was a donut there. And that donut was hollow. And the donut would provide the lubrication to the universal joint. And it was full of thin oil, like 30-weight oil, so it could flow through the orifices. But the oil would leak out. And the people didn't like the oil leaking out in the front of the car. And he says, well, we'll fix that. We'll just put a grease circuit in and put grease in it instead of oil. Well, the problem was the grease would not flow through the small orifices, and the joints wouldn't get lubrication, so they would wear out and burn out. I was told that probably when I was 12 years old. Another story would be, people in Van Wert would know what we call the Castle on South Washington Street. The Castle's still there. And there was a guy named Bill Hughes, and Bill was a friend of my uncle. And the Hugheses were very prominent people, had money, and they went to the 1933 Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago. And on display at the 33 World's Fair was a 12-cylinder convertible sedan, red, on a rotisserie that would rotate the car so you could see all the underside and all the workings of the car. Well, anyhow, Bill Hughes and my uncle bought that car off the display, and it was brought back to Van Wert and set in front of the Castle. That was told to me by Gaylord Leslie, and later on, I talked to a guy named Doc Gamble, Richard Gamble, and he said, I used to walk by that car on the way to school almost every day and just drool over this red Auburn. Then Gaylord Leslie said that Bill Hughes and his wife Diane drove the Auburn down to Florida to see a friend of theirs, Don Kahn, and Don liked the car so well that Bill just gave it to him. So that was the last I know about that car. And I'll tell more stories later. My uncle Dean Pennell was brilliant on emergency repair work. And he just loved to do it. And here's a letter that was written to the Auburn factory by one of his customers. And this is the original letter. It's hard to read. It was really a carbon copy. Back then they actually had carbon copies. And it's sort of not real distinct. My daughter took the letter and made it more readable. And it was written to the factory commending my uncle for the service he did on repairing a 898 Auburn. It says, I wish to take this means of advising you of an experience that I had with your Van Wert dealer, Mr. Dean Pennell, July 6th. Mr. Pennell rendered me service that would look on the surface to be almost impossibility in such a short length of time. I'm an owner of a custom model 898 purchased from George Dyer's Sons in Columbus. That business dealership is still around today selling Lamborghinis and Porsches. And while driving to Chicago on Highway 30, 9 miles west of Van Wert, another motorist came into the highway on the blind road, disregarding a stop sign, and crashed into my left rear end of my car, taking away the left fender and rear bumper, which almost threw me completely off the road, causing me to go head on into a telegraph pole on the right-hand side of the road, which completely demolished the front end of my car, including bumper, radiator shell, radiator cord, etc., together with a number of other small parts like fan and generator pulley. Here's the kicker. Their dealer, Mr. Pennell, towed this car of mine to Van Wert 9 miles, dismantled the car, and checked up for the parts and replacement necessary, then drove to your factory and back to Van Wert, the distance of 114 miles, reassembled the new parts, realigned the wheels, etc., and in other words, put my car absolutely in the condition of a new car, which it was before the accident, and turned the car over to me in a little less than 7 hours. I don't think he could have done that, but that's what the letter says. But all his life, he had a tool and die shop. He loved to do emergency repair work like this. He was very good at it. He okay. I'm going to move on to the next part of the story. Back at this point of time in the 30s, or the 20s and 30s, the interurbans were very vital to the economy of the whole Midwest. And there was a whole network of interurban cars, tracks, schedules, and the businesses could get materials very, very fast from the warehouses around the area in Fort Wayne and Lima to supply to small towns. In Van Wert, there was the Cincinnati Northern Railroad had what they called doodlebugs or gas electric doodlebugs that ran north and south. And this is a picture of one, a similar one in Fort Wayne, which would be an engine, and it'd be an engine, it'd be gas powered, it would run a generator, it would run the traction motors, and it would haul baggage. It actually had a post office in here where they could pick up mail, sort the mail, deliver it to the towns along the route of the track. These were originally powered by a 6-cylinder Winton gas engine. Later on, according to a guy named John Keller, who was an historian over in Lima at the Allen County Museum on this type of thing, says that they were converted to a V12 Lycoming engine, which had been a product of Cord Corporation. So that would be the engine. They had a trailer car for the passengers. There's another picture of the one that would, this number would be the one, this M100 would actually been the one that would have been in Van Wert. It ran north and south between Cincinnati, Ohio, and Jackson, Michigan. In the 30s, and these actually replaced, these were cheaper to operate than a steam locomotive. Here's a notation that they were stopping the services in the paper. There would no longer be any rail service going north. They still have rail service going south to Cincinnati from Van Wert. That was a big hit to a lot of people who depended on this rail traffic. When it was stopped, there was actually a 1-year overlap, but it took time for the railroad to get permission to stop the service. So there was a 1-year overlap. And what happened was Dean Pennell, who had the Auburn dealership, started the bus line to replace the Cincinnati Northern rail service. And here's one of the pictures from what they call the High Northern coach lines. And That's a cord, and that was actually, I got that from one of my cousins who was actually, they chartered my uncle for a sorority trip. My uncle also made 8-door cords. He bought them and modified them. And how I learned about that was I would, for many, many years, every morning, and the ritual was go to Baggett's coffee shop before I went to work. And I would always quizzing the old timers if they knew anything about my uncle and the Auburns and the Cords and stuff. And there was a guy named Leroy Eicher. And Leroy says, your uncle had some L29 Cords that had 8 doors. I didn't know that. And he said, yeah, and the later ones on the bus line looked like torpedoes or submarines, which would be probably the 810, 812 Cords. Well, here's a picture I got from Randy Ema, which we believe was one of Pennell's 8-door Cords that he had modified. And when I heard about this in the 90s, my first visit was down in Eckert Park before the Labor Day parade. I went back in Eckert Park, and I went back to where the Cords were, the L29 Cords, and there was a gentleman there who had a cord, and I got talking to him. His name was Bob Agel, an old-time club member. And I says, Bob, you know, some of the old-timers told me my uncle had some Cords that had 8 doors, and Bob's answer was, I know where the car is at. And here was another 8-door Cord that was found in the late 70s in Jackson, Michigan, which would be the north end of the bus line. This was found by Bill Dreest, and Bill bought it and then resold it to Ken Reber down in Canal, Winchester. And this still exists, but it's in terrible, terrible condition. But this is one of the 8-door Cords that was on the High Northern Coach line going between Van Wert and Jackson. I don't have pictures of what the ones that talked about being a torpedo or a submarine. This would have been the timetables and the map for the High Northern Coach lines between Van Wert and Jackson, Michigan. And also there was an interurban line that ran between Lima and Defiance. And the High Northern Coach line also replaced that service when the interurban lines went out. That's the blow up of the map. There was also, back in that period of time, the railroad would have daily excursions, and they go to resorts like Devil's Lake or Manitoba Beach. That would be resort areas. The High Northern Coach line also advertised that they would have the same excursions using the Auburns and the Cord limousines, the same location. I've written articles about the High Northern Coach line. And if you want a copy of that, I can send you a copy. You just take my card and send me an email. Okay. The other line that was replaced by Cords and Auburns was the interurban line that ran between Fort Wayne and Lima. I think it was 12 or 13 round trips daily. And it started in like 1903 up until 1932. And this would be a picture of one of the interurbans in downtown Van Wert. And used to be tracks right down the center of town. And towards the end, there used to be movies and stuff that would show the interurbans trying to get through the downtown areas, and there were more, the cars and the interurbans were fighting for space. And so, but the interurbans were vital. They were not only passengers, but they were small freight, packages, like the one ran between Van Wert and Fort Wayne. The businesses could get their stock replenished same day. Be like 12 or 13 round trips daily, and compare that to the service we have today with UPS, Postal Service, and say Amazon. This is a little bit more about the interurbans and the service. This is part of the routes. This would be between between Lima and Fort Wayne. And there'd be all these branches which you could. Here's the timetable. And in 1932, when the Fort Wayne-Lima Railroad stopped service, that's when a guy named L.J. Mitchell, who had the Greenville-Dayton bus line at that time that ran from Van Wert down to the Greenville-Dayton area, replaced the interurban service with Auburn limousines. And this was the notification that from the paper when the Greenville-Dayton was authorized by the Public Utilities Commission to start service using the Auburn and Cord limousines. This is the picture of the limousines in a building that still exists in Van Wert today, and he bought them from from Dean Pennell, the High Northern Coach Line. This picture here, that man there would be L.J. Mitchell. His wife, his widow, told me that it was always important for him to make sure his drivers looked neat and clean and were well dressed. Here's another picture. That's Virgil Spearman. Virgil, this is where the post office in Van Wert is today. That would be the Salt Scaber Mansion, I think, to the right. That would be the European Inn Hotel. And that was the bus station for both the High Northern Coach Line and the Greenville-Dayton Transportation Company that ran the Auburn limousines. I actually had a chance to interview Virgil Spearman before his passing, and he kept telling me that how reliable the Auburn cars were. And he just kept repeating it because I guess I understand that the later small buses that they used weren't as nearly reliable as the Auburn. There's the drivers for the Greenville-Dayton that drove the Auburn limousines. Now, if you look at the drivers for the Greenville-Dayton, and this was the Century Airlines that used the same vehicles. They had the boots, and there's some similarities to the dress. Jigger Johnson worked for Century Airlines, and he maintained these vehicles. And I think L.J. Mitchell hired him and brought him to Van Wert to maintain the vehicles for his bus line. I've written an article about the Greenville-Dayton Transportation Company. If you want an article, want a copy, just send me an email. That's what I have. One thing I forgot in the presentation I think is significant. I just remembered it. I'm still amazed at all the early car dealerships that Van Wert had and the quality of the buildings. You saw the Smith Garage, you saw the Bonnewitz building. There was other buildings of the same quality that were built in Van Wert. The Peony Festival started in '32, and they claimed that was second in size to the Rose Bowl. And I had a hard time grasping that. Is that exaggerated or whatever? And then once I got into it, I said, there's maybe some truth to that. But one thing that was going on prior to 1932 when the Peony Festival started, there were garden shows in Van Wert. We know about Wassenberg. There was other commercial flower gardens in Van Wert besides Wassenberg. And they would have garden shows that my wife discovered in her research that invited 500 garden clubs to exhibit. The flowers were exhibited in the car dealerships. I found that amazing. So I can revisit any pictures, or I can answer questions. Steve?
That Smith dealership that you talked about, was that the same one that was a Smith dealership when we were in high school?
Yeah, sold the American Motors. Yeah, that was Russ Smith, and he was the one thing I've talked to Steve the other Steve Smith, I guess, and about his grandfather, you know, and how did a guy operating a garage in a mule barn get the money to build a building like that? And where'd the money come from for these other car dealerships? You look at down where F&S floor covering, that was before it was covered, that was a nice brick building, well done. That was for Studebaker. Yeah.
And one of your slides, it says the Auburn dealership. And was there all work until we closed or anything else?
I think there were some lapses. And I think the ownership of Auburn changed, what, 3 times. It was owned by the Eckert family, then was owned by some investors up in Chicago, the Wrigleys, then eventually was owned by E.L. Cord and Cord Corporation. And there were some times that Auburn Company didn't do very well. And I think if the cars didn't sell well, the dealers are probably going to sell something different. They're going to change makes.
So when it said 1920, and that was the time of 19,
Yeah.
they probably stopped doing Auburn Auto.
Good chance, yeah. Yeah. My hope, you know, and I think that these buildings get restored back to the grandeur that they used to be. Yes.
Are all of the buildings on Lincoln Highway? Lincoln Highway.
Yes, the Smith and Bonnewitz both are. And they both would have been, that'd been Main Street. The Interurbans would go right down to the center of Main Street. And this garage operated for years, 24/7. Okay. Okay.